The morning of my daughter's wedding arrived quietly, almost too quietly, like the world was holding its breath. The sky outside my window was pale blue, flawless in a way that felt undeserved. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it, aware of the folded paper pressed against my chest inside my jacket. I hadn't meant to carry it today. Fathers are supposed to feel emotional on days like this. Nervous, proud, maybe a little afraid of letting go. What no one prepares you for is the fear that comes from knowing one decision you made might finally surface, and that today is the day it does. The house was already awake. Soft footsteps passed my door. Low voices, careful laughter. Somewhere downstairs, flowers were being arranged, their stems scraping lightly against glass. The smell of roses drifted upward, sweet and heavy, mixing with fresh coffee. Everything sounded exactly the way it should, and that was what unsettled me, because for weeks, every time I imagined this morning, it didn't end with applause or music. It ended with a pause, a moment where something invisible finally became impossible to ignore. My fingers brushed the folded paper again, more out of habit than intention. I had rewritten it more times than I could count, each version failing in a different way. Too gentle, too cruel, too late. In the end, I stopped trying to soften it. Some truths don't allow that. I tried not to think about the second copy. Earlier that morning, while the florist stepped away to take a call, I had leaned over the arrangement and slipped the paper into her bouquet. White flowers, a ribbon she had chosen herself. My hands had shaken as I did it, not because I feared being caught, but because I knew once it was there, the timing would no longer belong to me. When I saw her for the first time that morning, standing in her childhood bedroom in her wedding dress, I almost said her name out loud just to steady myself. She looked peaceful, certain, like someone who believed the hardest parts of her life were already behind her. She smiled and said, "I slept so well. Isn't that strange?" I nodded, afraid that if I spoke, she might hear what I was really thinking. On the drive to the venue, she talked about small things, the weather, the music, how quickly the year had passed. I watched the road and wondered how many lives change, not because of loud decisions, but because of quiet ones that wait patiently to be discovered. As the guests stood and the music began, I noticed her fingers tighten around the bouquet. She didn't know what was hidden there yet, but I did. And as she took her first step down the aisle, I realized that if she read that note at the wrong moment, it wouldn't just stop the wedding. It would permanently change the way she saw me. As she walked down the aisle, I wasn't watching her face. I was watching her hands. The bouquet rested against her dress, the white petals brushing softly against the fabric with each step. To anyone else, it looked like nerves. To me, it looked like instinct, the kind that surfaces when something familiar feels wrong, even before the mind can explain why. Years ago, I had learned that instinct doesn't come from fear, it comes from memory. The memory came back to me suddenly, sharp enough to make my throat tighten, not from her childhood, but from much earlier, before she was born, before there was a wedding to stop. I had been standing in a very different room back then, holding a very different envelope, being asked a question I hadn't been prepared for. It wasn't a criminal question, no police, no threats, just a quiet, professional voice telling me that some things, once known, don't disappear simply because we choose not to speak them aloud. That was the moment I first understood the kind of secret this was. It wasn't about betrayal in the way people usually imagine it. It wasn't an affair whispered about at family dinners or a lie told to protect someone's feelings. It was a foundational secret, the kind that reshapes identity once it surfaces, the kind that changes how you understand your own past. I told myself then that I was protecting her. That was a justification I carried for years. Protection, stability, timing. I convinced myself that love meant choosing silence, even if that silence was built on something incomplete, especially if it was incomplete. As she reached the front of the aisle, she glanced toward me, just briefly, Her eyes met mine, and for a fraction of a second, I saw confusion flicker there. Not suspicion, recognition, as if some part of her already knew today was heavier than it was supposed to be. I wondered, not for the first time, if children sense these things long before we give them names. The officiant began to speak, words about loves, about joining lives, about honesty. Each sentence landed harder than the last. Honesty, commitment, truth, spoken in front of witnesses. My hands curled into fists at my sides. The note in her bouquet did not accuse anyone. It did not name names. It asked a single question, a question that had followed me quietly for decades and that, once asked out loud, could not be unheard. I had written it that way on purpose, because if she read it, she wouldn't stop the wedding out of anger. She would stop it out of doubt, and doubt is far more dangerous. As the ceremony continued, she shifted the bouquet slightly, adjusting her grip. A small movement, an unconscious one, that I knew that gesture. I had made it myself years ago when I was handed information that didn't fit the life I believed I was living. The flowers rustled softly, and I realized that once she unfolded that paper, she wouldn't just question her future, she would question her origin. What I hadn't anticipated was that she wouldn't be the first one that day to recognize what the note was really asking, and when someone else's reaction changed, everything accelerated. The officiant's words continued, but my attention shifted before the line about promises was even finished. From the corner of my eye, I saw her mother's expression change. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A stiffening at the shoulders, a tightening of the lips. Her eyes flicked toward the bouquet, not fully landing on it, but enough to betray recognition. Someone else knew. I hadn't counted on that. Her mother's reaction didn't scream alarm. It was quieter, a microsecond of hesitation, a pause that made the air in the room feel heavier, the kind of pause that speaks louder than any whisper. I remembered that morning how I had hesitated over the note, how I'd decided to hide it not only in my daughter's bouquet, but in plain sight, knowing it might be discovered sooner than planned. I had expected curiosity, maybe confusion, but not recognition. Recognition suggested shared history. The secret was no longer mine alone to guard. As the bride's father, I had long convinced myself that the note was a tool to preserve her life, her future, her sense of security. But now I realized it existed in a domain far wider than any of us had imagined, a legacy, something that could define bloodlines, family reputation, and long-buried truths that weren't merely personal, they were generational. The guests, oblivious, smiled and murmured at the ceremonial words, but I felt the room's atmosphere bend. Some part of the universe had shifted, even if no one else could see it yet. Her mother's eyes met mine briefly. No words passed, but the gravity of that look was unmistakable. We both knew this note had consequences far beyond the wedding. I tightened my jaw and focused on my daughter. She walked on, unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. But instinct has a way of whispering before consciousness notices. Her steps slowed slightly. She brushed the flowers absent-mindedly, not realizing that each movement was a countdown. I thought about the words I had written, carefully, deliberately ambiguous. The note didn't say who, what, or how. It only hinted at an origin, a choice, a hidden fact that could undo the narrative of her entire life. And yet, as I watched her, I understood something I hadn't before. The note wouldn't just affect her. It would ripple outward, touching every person connected to this day. Some would be shocked, some would be angry, and some would act. Her mother shifted again, subtly, as if to shield herself from seeing what was coming, but shielding doesn't stop consequences. I realized then that it wasn't my daughter who would have to make the first choice today. Someone else had already seen the note, and what they did next would set the real chain of events in motion. The moment came almost silently. Her mother's hand shifted in her lap, brushing the edge of her dress. Just a subtle movement, but enough. I noticed it instantly. Her eyes flicked again toward the bouquet. sharper this time, almost imperceptibly. Then came the sound, a barely audible gasp, swallowed before it could reach full volume, but still loud enough for me to catch it. My stomach sank. Control was gone. Somewhere behind us, I felt the shift. A guest to the side leaned forward, curiosity piqued. A bridesmaid's hand hovered at her chest, as if she'd just realized something was wrong, but couldn't place it. The ceremony, meant to be smooth and graceful, wavered in rhythm. The bouquet pressed heavier in my daughter's hands. She didn't look down yet, but the small tightening of her fingers told me instinct had already begun to whisper warnings she couldn't yet hear. I tried to breathe, tried to tell myself it was fine, but my mind raced. Every reaction I saw, from her mother, from the bridesmaid, from the guests, was a reminder that the secret wasn't safe anymore. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. All these years, I had held it close, believing timing and discretion were enough. But now, it was slipping. Not fast, not violently, but enough to unravel quietly, like a thread tugged at the wrong edge. Her mother shifted again, this time raising her eyes toward someone at the back of the room. A man, a distant relative I hadn't noticed before, froze mid-whisper. His gaze locked onto the bouquet. The tiny flicker of recognition in his expression made me feel the air constrict. I realized then that it wasn't just my daughter who would face the choice. It wasn't even just her mother. The note had begun a ripple, and the first person to act would force a chain reaction. And each micro-reaction I saw, the subtle twitch of the bride's hand, the sideways glance of the bridesmaid, the stiffening of her mother's shoulders, added weight to the moment. Small events, seemingly meaningless, combined into something impossible to ignore. The room's rhythm changed. The music seemed softer, distant, irrelevant. Every eye, even those pretending not to notice, held a hint of anticipation. I realized with a jolt, the first choice wouldn't belong to her. It would belong to the one who saw first, and that choice would set everything in motion. Her mother's lips parted slightly. The man at the back shifted in his seat. The bouquet moved in her hands. And then I saw it. Someone else had picked up on the note. The moment they acted, nothing would ever be the same. The gasp I had caught a moment ago wasn't the only one. Her mother's hand shot forward before anyone could stop her, brushing the edge of the bouquet. The petals shifted, and the folded note peeked out just enough to be seen. My stomach lurched. The bridesmaid beside her froze, eyes widening. A faint murmur ran through the nearest guests. People glanced at each other, whispering quietly, but with urgent curiosity that I could feel in the pit of my chest. Her mother's fingers closed over the note, and for a heartbeat she held it still, hesitant. Then, almost reflexively, she unfolded it just enough to read the first line. Her eyes flicked across the words, and a subtle tightening of her jaw made me realize she understood immediately. I saw it before she even glanced at me. The color in her face shifted. The faint blush of calm replaced by something colder. Fear, confusion, recognition. The bouquet trembled in my daughter's hands as she instinctively followed her mother's gaze. Her eyes narrowed slightly, sensing something was different. And then the ripple began. The man at the back, the distant relative I had only noticed in part 4, leaned forward again, his curiosity now edged with concern. His eyes locked on the partially exposed note. His lips moved in a whisper to someone beside him. The murmurs spread like tiny sparks across dry grass. I tried to stay calm, tried to convince myself that the moment was small, that it could be contained, but I knew better. Once someone else interacted with the note, even inadvertently, control had already slipped from my hands. Her mother folded the note back slightly, her hand lingering over it. The weight of what she had read pressed down on her like gravity. She didn't speak. She couldn't. But the look in her eyes said everything. A truth had been uncovered that could not be ignored, and she understood the stakes far better than I did. The bride's fingers tightened, gripping the bouquet as if to shield it, unaware that the hidden paper had already shifted the balance of the room. Her steps faltered just slightly, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my heart race. In that brief pause, I realized the first domino had fallen. The note was no longer dormant. Someone had read it, someone had understood it, and the moment they acted, even quietly, the world I had tried to protect would begin to unravel. And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was only the beginning. The choice her mother had made would force my daughter to confront a truth she hadn't even imagined, and it was about to happen in front of everyone. Her fingers froze mid-grip on the bouquet. Her eyes darted to her mother. The color had drained from her mother's face. The bouquet trembled in her hands. A whisper, barely audible, the first words from the mother. "Oh my God!" The bridesmaids stiffened. A few guests leaned forward. Heads turned, eyes flicked to the bouquet. The murmurs spread. Her mother's hand hovered over the note. She didn't fold it back completely, just enough to let her daughter glimpse the edge of what was written. The bride's breath hitched. Her lips parted. She blinked, trying to process what she was seeing. Her steps faltered. One foot stopped, then the other. The music seemed louder now, but distant, almost irrelevant. The man at the back whispered something to the relative beside him. The words didn't matter. The tone did. Alarmed, urgent, low. The bride's eyes widened. The bouquet shook slightly. She instinctively held it closer, shielding it, as if that would hide what had been partially revealed. Her mother's gaze didn't leave her, not blinking, not speaking, just a silent intensity that pressed down like a weight. Guests started noticing. Some leaned forward, others whispered. Heads swiveled, eyes searched. The ceremony's rhythm fractured. The officiant's words fell flat. The bride looked down at the bouquet again, and then she saw it, the corner of the note, partially unfolded. Her hands tightened. Her heartbeat picked up. The room seemed to shrink around her. The whispers grew. One bridesmaid gasped. Someone coughed nervously. The tension became almost physical. She took a step backward, then another. Her veil shifted slightly. Brushing her face, she tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her mother finally spoke, voice low, trembling. "You need to read this." A silence fell, heavy, expectant. The bride glanced at the guests, at the faces frozen in curiosity and concern, then back at the note. Her fingers hovered over it, slowly, hesitatingly, and as she lifted it to read the first line, I felt the room change completely. In that instant, I realized this was no longer just a secret between us. The moment she read it, everything, her wedding, her trust, our family, would be tested in ways none of us could stop. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the note further. Eyes scanning the words, her breath hitched. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Each line seemed to weigh more than the last. Her shoulders hunched slightly. She gripped the bouquet tighter, pressing it against her chest, as if it could shield her from the truth. Her lips moved, whispering words to herself she couldn't quite form aloud. I saw it in her eyes. Fear, but also a spark of recognition, something she had felt deep down, now confirmed. Around her, subtle shifts spread. Guests leaned forward, sensing the tension without knowing why. One bridesmaid's hand rose to her mouth, covering a gasp. A cousin at the back whispered urgently to the person next to him. Heads turned, eyes searching. The bride blinked rapidly, trying to process the note. Her knees felt weaker. A step forward, a step back. Her veil brushed against her face, dampened slightly with sweat. Her mother remained frozen, gaze fixed, waiting, not saying a word, just letting her daughter absorb it. Her breath came faster now, uneven. She swallowed hard. The bouquet shook again. She lifted it slightly, glancing around at the guests, faces filled with curiosity and subtle worry. Some whispered, some watched silently, unsure what was happening. Her hands hovered over the note for a moment longer. Then she folded it back slightly, pressing it to her chest. Her lips parted. Her eyes scanned the room, catching every subtle movement. The sideways glance of a bridesmaid, the tightening jaw of a relative, the faint widening of eyes behind her. It was too late. Everyone had noticed. Her mind raced. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, like gravity on her shoulders. She knew that whatever the note said, a choice was coming, one she couldn't avoid. Her fingers flexed. The bouquet trembled again. She took a shallow breath, trying to steady herself, but the tremor in her hands gave her away. A whisper came from behind, not audible to the crowd. Her mother's voice, low, almost pleading. "Decide. You have to decide now." The bride's eyes darted from person to person. The room felt smaller. The music was still playing, but distant, irrelevant. Her gaze returned to the note. She pressed it tightly against her chest. Her face tightened, her jaw clenched. Her body shifted, readying for the first visible, irreversible action. And in that instant, I knew the decision she was about to make would change everything. Her wedding, her life, and all of us around her, forever. Her fingers tightened around the bouquet. She took a deep breath, and then she stopped walking, mid-step. The music faltered, the officiant's voice catching on the next line. Guests shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. Her mother's hand shot out instinctively, hovering over hers, but it was too late. The bride lifted the bouquet higher, holding the note out for everyone to see, not to read aloud, but enough that the tension in the room became visible. Gasps rippled through the guests. Murmurs spread, low and anxious. The bridesmaids leaned forward, unsure whether to intervene. The distant relative who had noticed the note earlier froze, staring at the unfolding scene. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, scanned the room. Each face seemed to press a question against her: curiosity, alarm, silent judgment. The bouquet shook slightly in her hands, the note partially exposed. She didn't lower it. She didn't retreat. She just held it, trembling, letting the visible secret linger between her and everyone else. Her mother's jaw tightened. Her fingers twitched as if to snatch it away, but she hesitated. Something in her expression told me even she knew the gravity of letting this moment play out. The guests murmured more urgently now. Some whispered, some gasped. The ceremony's rhythm had fractured completely. The officiant paused mid-sentence, looking uncertain. A cousin leaned forward, whispering to the person beside him. The words didn't matter. Their tone did. Urgent, incredulous, frightened. Bride's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't speak. She didn't explain. Her body alone conveyed the message. The note had shifted the entire room, and her decision was immediate and deliberate. I watched, frozen. The weight of what she held and the reactions it triggered pressed down on me. Every movement, small, silent, controlled, had consequences I couldn't reverse. The bouquet wavered in her grip. She stepped slightly back, tilting the paper toward the guests just enough that every eye could catch a hint. And that was when I realized it. The first domino had fallen. The ceremony was no longer about vows, music, or celebration. It was about the note, the secret, and the bride's choice to reveal, even partially, had changed the rules of the day entirely. I knew one thing for certain. Once she had taken that action, nothing would return to normal, and the next person to react could ignite a confrontation that no one in that room would be prepared for. The room froze for a heartbeat. Then it erupted in subtle chaos. Her mother's hand is shot out again, this time trembling, but she didn't touch the bouquet. Instead, she leaned closer, whispering urgently, low enough that only her daughter could hear. Her eyes pleaded, almost frantic. "Stop! Don't show them everything." The distant relative at the back leaned forward, squinting. His mouth opened in surprise, then closed again. He whispered something sharp to the guest beside him, a hiss that carried through the quiet. Heads turned, guests shifted in their seats. Whispers multiplied, like sparks racing across dry kindling. The bridesmaids exchanged alarmed glances. One touched her throat nervously, another pressed a hand to her chest. Even the young flower girl hesitated mid-step, sensing the sudden change in the room. The officiant cleared his throat, but the words faltered. The ceremony's rhythm splintered. Music seemed muffled, distant, irrelevant. All eyes gradually returned to her. The bride stood, trembling slightly, bouquet held like a shield. She met each gaze evenly, as if daring anyone to intervene. Her mother exhaled sharply, a mix of fear and frustration, trying to regain control, but the note had already done its work. Social order had shifted. What had been calm and ceremonial was now fragile and volatile. The distant relative whispered again, this time louder. A single word escaped, "Impossible." Murmurs spread. Some guests craned forward. Others whispered urgently, like they were trying to decide if they should intervene or wait. Every subtle movement, the tightening of a jaw, the narrowing of an eye, added weight. The bride's hands shook, but she didn't lower the bouquet. She could feel the tension in the room like a physical force pressing against her chest. Every reaction, from her mother, from the relative, from the bridesmaid, confirmed the same thing. This note was no longer private. Her mind raced, but her body betrayed her struggle. She shifted slightly, adjusting the bouquet. The motion drew the eyes of every guest. Gasps and low murmurs punctuated the room, some involuntary, some deliberate. I realized with a sinking certainty that the first emotional reaction could come from anyone. A scream, a demand, even a sudden withdrawal. It wouldn't take much, and once it happened, the ceremony wouldn't recover. Her eyes flicked across the crowd, absorbing each micro-reaction. A choice loomed, not just in her hands, but in the potential actions of everyone around her. And then I saw it. The first guest, unable to hold back, reacting visibly. The tension snapped, and the moment I feared had arrived. The chain reaction had begun. The hush shattered with a sharp gasp from the man at the back. He stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. Eyes wide, voice shaking, he pointed toward the bouquet. "What is this?" he demanded, loud enough that the whispering crowd flinched. The room exploded. Guests murmured, some leaning forward, some recoiling. The officiant froze mid-sentence, uncertainty flashing across his face. Music halted. The ceremony's rhythm disintegrated. Her mother gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. She stepped closer, as if to shield her daughter, but the gesture did nothing to contain the storm. Her gaze flicked between the bouquet and the shouting relative, panic mixing with disbelief. The bride's fingers tightened around the bouquet. She stood frozen, face pale, jaw clenched, eyes darting across the room. The note trembled in her hands. Every heartbeat pressed against the tension like a drum. A bridesmaid whispered urgently, "Should we stop this?" Her voice was hushed, but it carried the weight of fear and confusion. The other bridesmaids exchanged nervous glances. Guests shifted in their seats, some standing, some craning forward, all pulled into the chaos. The distant relative repeated himself, louder this time. "This cannot be real. Someone explain." The bride's lips moved, a whisper escaping her. I didn't know." Her voice faltered, trembling under the weight of all eyes. She pressed the bouquet closer, shielding the note, but the motion only drew more attention. Her mother's hands shook. She glanced at me, panic-stricken, as if begging for a solution, but I couldn't stop it. The note had already unleashed its force. Every whisper, every glance, every subtle gasp fed the tension. The ceremony had transformed. It was no longer about vows, music, or celebration. It was about the truth now partially revealed, and the reactions it provoked. A few guests began whispering to each other, voices quickening, low and urgent. One man stood, scanning the room with suspicion. Another leaned toward his partner, whispering something that made her gasp audibly. The bride's knees trembled. She swallowed hard, realizing she could no longer retreat into silence. The first domino had fallen, and every reaction that followed compounded the urgency. Her mother stepped forward, voice tight and urgent. "Stop! Everyone, please stop!" But no one could. The tension had become contagious. The note had done its work. Every movement, every whisper, every widened eye told her that what she had in her hands was now a force that couldn't be contained. And in that moment, I understood. The first reaction had broken the dam. The next choice, the next word, the next movement would determine whether this wedding could survive or collapse entirely. Silence didn't return. The room throbbed with it, a silence filled not with calm but with anticipation. The distant relative's shout had broken the fragile order, and now every eye was on her. The bride's gaze swept across the crowd. Faces turned toward her. Some were curious. Some were shocked. Some were outright suspicious. Her hands shook around the bouquet. The note felt heavier now, almost alive, as if it were feeding off the tension. Her breath hitched. Her chest tightened. Every instinct screamed to hide, to fold it back, to pretend nothing had happened. But she couldn't. Not now. Her mother stepped closer, voice low but urgent. "You have to stop this," she whispered. Panic edged every syllable. Her eyes flicked toward the guests, silently pleading for control, for order, for anything that could contain the chaos. The bridesmaids exchanged alarmed glances. One pressed a hand to her chest. The other leaned forward slightly, whispering something to the person beside her. The ripples spread. Guests leaned in, craning their necks, whispering, gesturing subtly. The ceremony had dissolved into a storm of anticipation and fear. The bride's jaw tightened. Every glance at the crowd made her stomach churn. She had wanted control over this moment, but control had vanished the instant the first person reacted. Now she was acutely aware of everyone else, their curiosity, their judgments, their panic. The distant relative muttered again, louder, to the person beside him. This is unbelievable. What's going on?" Her mother's hands shook visibly, as though the weight of all eyes on her daughter pressed against her own skin. She tried to step between the bride and the crowd, but even that small gesture couldn't shield her. Whispers multiplied. Murmurs turned into faint gasps. Some gasps shifted forward, some leaned back. Every reaction fed the room's tension. Every second stretched, electric, unbearable. The bride glanced down at the bouquet. The note, partially exposed, was now fully unavoidable. Her mind raced. She could see it in everyone else's eyes. They were waiting for her next move. The responsibility, the pressure, pressed down on her like a physical weight. Each subtle movement, her mother's shifting stance, the relative leaning closer, a bridesmaid whispering, made it clear. Choices had to be made, and they had to be made fast. Hesitation now was dangerous. Her fingers flexed around the bouquet. Her pulse raced. Every instinct screamed that the next action would determine the direction of the storm she had just unleashed. And I knew, with a tightening in my chest, that the moment she moved next, the full consequences of the note would start to unravel, and there would be no turning back. Her hands shook as she straightened her posture. Every eye in the room was on her. The note felt like fire in her grasp, impossible to ignore. She swallowed hard. her pulse thundered. Then, slowly, deliberately, she unfolded it further. Her voice was barely above a whisper at first. It says, the words caught in her throat, but she pressed on, letting fragments slip into the air, audible enough for some of the guests to hear. A line here, a phrase there, just enough to hint at the truth without revealing it entirely. Gasps rippled instantly. Whispers erupted. Some guests leaned forward, straining to hear. Others leaned back, covering their mouths in shock. The ceremony had completely lost its rhythm. Her mother's face went pale. She pressed a hand to her lips, eyes darting between the note and her daughter. Panic surged in every micro-expression. The bridesmaids stiffened. One whispered frantically to the other, gesturing toward the bride. The distant relative's jaw tightened. He muttered under his breath, disbelief spilling into visible tension. The bride's hands trembled, but she did not falter. Her voice quivered as she continued, exposing only hints, carefully chosen fragments. Inside, fear collided with obligation. She wanted to retreat, to hide the note, to pretend nothing had happened. But curiosity burned hotter. She had to know what it said, had to understand it fully. And yet, she also understood the weight of the choice she was making in front of everyone. The room seemed to shrink around her. Each whisper, each widened eye, each subtle gasp amplified the urgency. She realized immediately this was not just her choice anymore. Every reaction, every shift in posture, every trembling hand added momentum to something far larger than herself. Her mother stepped closer, voice tight and urgent. "Stop! You have to stop!" But the bride only shook her head. The note demanded attention, and she could not pretend it didn't exist. A bridesmaid gasped audibly. The distant relative leaned forward, hands gripping his knees. Guests murmured urgently. Every reaction magnified the tension, feeding it back into her, sharpening her focus, heightening the fear and anticipation. Her lips pressed together. Her breath came in short, fast bursts. The fragments she had spoken were enough to make the consequences unavoidable. She felt the weight of every eye, every judgment, every ripple she had triggered. And in that moment, I knew the first choice had been made. The note's truth had begun to spread, and nothing in that room, not the vows, not the music, not the carefully constructed wedding, could stop the chain reaction now. The whispers grew louder, spilling into half-formed sentences. She can't mean that. Is that real? Guests leaned forward, craning their necks, straining for clarity. Some covered their mouths. Others whispered urgently to one another, gesturing toward the bouquet, toward the bride. The mother stepped forward, voice sharp now, cutting through the murmurs. "Stop this! Put it away!" Her hands shook visibly as she reached for the bouquet, but the bride recoiled slightly, holding it closer. The note had slipped past control. It was alive in the room, demanding attention. The bridesmaids exchanged panicked glances. One whispered frantically to the other, her voice tight with fear. A cousin muttered something sharp, leaning forward, eyes darting between the note and the bride. The bride's chest heaved. She realized she couldn't undo what she had done. Every fragment she had revealed had already ignited curiosity, judgment, and suspicion. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a tangible force pressing against her from all sides. Her hands trembled. The bouquet felt heavier with every gaze. She could see it in her mother's eyes, the desperate attempt to regain control, to shield her daughter from the fallout, but she knew it was too late. The distant relative muttered again, louder this time. "Someone needs to explain, right now." Her mother's jaw clenched. She pressed her palms together, trying to ground herself, trying to force order, but the room resisted. Guests shifted, murmured, gasped, every subtle movement feeding the chaos. The bride's mind raced. She had wanted to understand a note, to confront its truth, but now she understood that her choice had consequences far beyond her own fear or curiosity. The ceremony was unraveling around her. A subtle movement caught her eye, a bridesmaid leaning closer to a guest, whispering something urgent, her eyes wide. Another relative glanced at someone across the aisle, an expression of suspicion spreading across his face. Small reactions, almost invisible, but each one a spark, beating the fire. She realized then the note had become a catalyst. What she had partially revealed was only the beginning. Every whispered question, every glance, every gasp could trigger a new wave, an unplanned reaction, a secondary revelation that would complicate the scene further. Her knees felt weak, her lips parted slightly. She pressed the bouquet tighter, heart pounding, knowing that every moment now required action, or risk being swept away in the growing storm. And I knew the first wave of consequences had only begun. The room was alive with reactions, and the next spark, whether from mother, relative, or guest, could ignite a fire no one could contain. A sharp voice cut through the murmurs. "Enough!" It was a distant relative. He stepped forward, eyes blazing, pointing at the bride. "This is not acceptable. Someone explain what's happening." The room stiffened. Guests turned fully toward him. Whispers halted mid-sentence. Tension coiled like a spring, ready to snap. The bride froze, a bouquet clutched to her chest. Her pulse raced, her hands trembled. Every eye in the room was on her. The fragments she had revealed, the partial truth, had sparked a force she could no longer control. Her chest tightened. Fear, panic, and a strange sense of obligation battled inside her. She had wanted to understand the note. She had wanted to confront its truth. But now it wasn't just her decision anymore. Every word she had spoken, every fragment exposed, had ignited something bigger. Her mother stepped forward, voice quivering but firm. "Please, stop. This isn't the way." She reached for the bouquet, trying to intervene, but the bride held it away slightly, unwilling to release control entirely. The crowd shifted, murmurs spiking as they sensed the brewing confrontation. The bridesmaids fidgeted nervously. One clutched her chest, eyes wide. Another whispered urgently to a guest nearby. The tension spread like wildfire. The bride's eyes darted across the room. Every subtle movement, the tightening jaw of a relative, the shifting stance of a bridesmaid, the desperate glance of her mother reminded her that this moment had grown beyond her control. She realized with a jolt, the note was no longer a private secret. Its effects were spreading uncontrollably, reaching into every corner of the ceremony, touching everyone present. Each reaction added weight, pushing the wedding closer to a breaking point. The distant relative took another step forward, voice rising. Someone must answer. Her mother pressed her hands together, almost begging, eyes darting over the crowd. "Please, we can handle this privately," she urged, but the words barely carried, drowned by murmurs and gasps. The bride's fingers flexed around the bouquet. She felt the inevitability pressing in. Every person in that room was now part of the unfolding storm. Every whispered question, every subtle gesture, every glance had the power to escalate the chaos. A ripple of realization passed through her. Whatever came next, it would change everything. The ceremony, the family, the vows, nothing would be the same. And in that instant, I understood that the next move, by her mother, or by anyone else, would determine whether the wedding would survive or collapse completely before it even began. The bride's hands tightened around the bouquet. Her chest heaved. Every heartbeat felt like it could shatter the fragile calm left in the room. Then, with a sharp, deliberate motion, she unfolded the note fully. Gasps erupted. The words were still mostly private, but enough slipped into view. enough to ignite recognition in the first few rows. The tension went electric. Her mother stepped forward, voice breaking, eyes wide. "Stop! You don't understand what you're doing." But the bride didn't flinch. She met her mother's gaze evenly, holding the note like a shield, like a declaration. Fear and obligation clashed with determination. The guests reacted instantly. Some leaned back, wide-eyed, mouths open in disbelief. Others whispered urgently, muttering to one another. A few moved closer as if to intervene, but hesitation held them at bay. The bridesmaids froze. Their hands trembled. One pressed a hand to her chest, swallowing audibly. Another glanced toward her partner, whispering with urgent concern. The distant relative took a step forward, jaw tight. "This is outrageous," he barked, voice rising. "Someone stop this." The bride's pulse raced, but she held firm. She could feel the weight of every gaze, every expectation, every fear pressing down on her. She realized now she could not undo this. Every choice she had made, every fragment revealed, every reaction triggered, had set a chain in motion she could not reverse. Her mother's hands shook as she reached again, pleading, almost desperate. "Please, for the sake of the wedding, for all of us, don't do this." But the bride's voice finally cut through, quiet yet firm. "It has to be done. I can't. I won't ignore it." The room stiffened. The whispers faltered, replaced by a tense silence, every guest holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The tension was no longer contained. It radiated outward from her, infecting everyone. Every subtle gesture, the tightening of a jaw, a shifting stance, a held breath, felt magnified. Her decision was irreversible. The wedding had reached a tipping point. There was no retreat, no turning back. The note's truth had begun to carve its path, and everyone in the room was now swept into its wake. And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that the next moments would decide whether this day would end in celebration, confrontation, or heartbreak, and that nothing could stop the chain reaction she had set in motion. The moment the note was fully revealed, the room erupted. The mother's hands shot up, trembling, her face flushed, eyes wide with panic and fury. "How could you?" she whispered, voice cracking. "Do you even realize what this means?" The distant relative leaned forward, jaw tight, fists clenched. "This is disgraceful," he barked, pointing toward the bride. "Someone needs to take responsibility." The bridesmaids exchanged nervous glances. One whispered urgently to another, voice tight, shaking. Another leaned toward a guest, muttering in disbelief. Gasps and whispers mingled, forming a tense, almost tangible hum throughout the crowd. Guests shifted uneasily, murmurs turning into soft exclamations. Some leaned forward as if to intervene. Others leaned back, stunned, unable to process the sudden chaos. The bride's chest heaved. She clutched the bouquet, knuckles white. Fear and panic clawed at her, but beneath it, a steady thread of resolve hardened. She could no longer retreat. She had made her choice. She had unleashed a force she could not contain. Her eyes scanned the room. Every reaction she saw, the mother's desperate attempt to regain control, the relative's rigid anger, the guest's curiosity and judgment, made her pulse quicken. She realized fully that this was no longer about her alone. It was about everyone in the room. A murmured challenge erupted near the front row. A guest leaned forward, voice rising. "This is not right. Someone stop this madness." Another followed, louder this time. The tension twisted, tightened, ready to snap. Her mother's face turned red, voice sharp now. "Enough! Stop this immediately!" She stepped closer, almost desperate, but careful not to touch the bouquet. The bride's fingers flexed around the note. Her pulse raced, every instinct screaming both fear and certainty. She knew there was no turning back. Whatever chaos had begun would continue, and she had to face it head on. Eyes darted around. Every subtle movement in the room, the narrowing of a gaze, the shifting of weight, a shallow gasp, felt like kindling against an already blazing fire. Then, at the very edge of the room, someone moved abruptly. A hand rose, a gasp, a flash of anger in their eyes. And in that instant, I knew the first aggressive move had been made, and the storm that would follow was about to sweep through the entire wedding. Chaos rippled outward. The guest who had made the first move stepped forward, hand raised as if to grab the bouquet. "Give it here," he demanded, voice sharp, trembling with anger. The bride's hands tightened, clutching the flowers like a lifeline. She took a small step back, eyes wide, heart hammering. Fear pressed against her chest, but beneath it, a flicker of resolve burned. She would not let go. Not yet. Her mother lunged forward, voice cracking. "Stop! You can't just take it. This is private. My daughter, my family." Her hands shook violently as she reached for the note, desperate to shield her child from the mounting storm. The bridesmaids froze, unsure whether to intervene or step aside. A whisper grew into a low hum as guests murmured to one another, some pointing, some gesturing subtly toward their neighbors. The tension spread like wildfire. The distant relative's jaw clenched, his fists pressed into his sides. "This is an outrage. Someone control this," he barked, stepping closer, scanning for anyone who would act or escalate further. The bride's breath came in short bursts. Her pulse pounded like a drum. Every glance, every movement, every gasp reminded her that she could no longer retreat. She had released a force that could no longer be contained. One guest edged closer, hesitating, hand twitching as if to intervene physically. Another whispered urgently to a nearby relative, a tone of fear and accusation threading through the words. The whispers amplified, bouncing across the room, infecting everyone with panic and suspicion. Her mother's voice rose again, sharper, desperate. "Put it down. Stop talking about it. Now." Her eyes darted from the bouquet to her daughter's face, silently begging for compliance. But the bride's expression was firm, resolute, almost defiant. The bride's gaze swept the room. Every subtle reaction, the tightening of a jaw, the shift of a shoulder, a held breath, spoke volumes. She realized the full weight of what she had unleashed. This was no longer contained to her, her mother, or the distant relative. The ripple had spread outward, touching every guest, every whispering family member, every curious eye. A hush fell briefly as the tension coiled, and then a shocking realization struck me. My chest tightened. The father, standing silently near the front, had gone pale. His eyes darted around the room, taking in every reaction, every movement. He understood in that instant the ceremony itself could collapse. Everything carefully planned, the vows, the celebration, the unity of family, was teetering on the edge. One wrong move, one loud word, one desperate action, and it could all shatter. And then I saw it. The father's hand trembled as he stepped forward, and I knew the next choice he made could either contain the chaos or send it spiraling completely out of control. The father's chest tightened. He felt the weight of every gaze, every whisper, every movement in the room pressing down on him. Fear and responsibility tangled inside him. He had to act, but every choice carried risk. One wrong word, one misstep, and everything could collapse. He stepped forward slowly, deliberate, hands slightly raised as if to hold back the storm. The guests leaned forward, anticipation crackling in the air. Some whispered, some held their breath. Others froze, eyes wide, waiting to see what he would do. His gaze swept the room, landing on the bride. Her hands clutched the bouquet, eyes fierce and resolute. He could see the determination there, and the fear, too. He knew that confronting her would be like walking on a tightrope over a chasm. "Everyone, please," he said firmly, voice shaking just enough to betray his anxiety. "Let's calm down. We are here for a wedding, not chaos." The distant relative snorted, unconvinced, stepping closer. Calm down. After what she's done? This is not normal. The father's eyes flicked to his wife. Her hands shook, lips pressed together, desperate to reclaim control. He understood her fear, her frustration, but also realized she was powerless without his intervention. He moved closer to the bride, reaching for the bouquet. His fingers brushed against hers. "We can handle this quietly," he urged, careful not to touch the note itself, but to signal containment. For a moment, it seemed to work. Some whispers softened. A few guests shifted back, as if relief had washed over them. Then the bride's eyes met his, a flash of defiance. She took a small step back, pressing the bouquet tighter to her chest. Her lips trembled as she whispered something barely audible. "I can't stop now. They need to know." The father froze. His hand hovered in midair. Panic surged. Every instinct screamed to intervene, but the moment had passed. The chain reaction he had hoped to temper now threatened to spiral further. The mother gasped, stepping forward, her voice rising in alarm. "Don't! Please, for all of us, don't!" Guests leaned forward again. Murmurs spiked. Some whispered urgent warnings to each other. Others tried to move closer, uncertain whether to intervene or watch in horror. The ceremony had paused. The music stopped, the vows forgotten, all attention focused on the unfolding chaos. He realized with a sinking dread, choices had to be made in front of everyone. There was no private solution now. The stakes had grown beyond control. And then I saw it. A relative's hand flicked toward the bouquet, eyes blazing with anger, and I knew that whatever happened next could either force the wedding to continue in utter chaos or stop it entirely, right then and there. The relative's hand shot toward the bouquet. His fingers trembled with rage. "Give it to me," he barked, eyes blazing, jaw tight. His voice carried through the room, silencing murmurs for a heartbeat, only to make tension spike higher. The bride's grip tightened. She recoiled slightly but did not release the bouquet. Her eyes locked on him, defiance mingling with fear. Every instinct screamed at her to protect the note, to hold onto control. She took a step backward, stance firm, refusing to yield. Her mother gasped, stepping forward, voice high and urgent. "Stop, please. This is my daughter. She has the right to—" Her words fractured as she realized she had lost the ability to command the room. The father moved between them, hands outstretched. "Enough." His voice rang out, trembling but authoritative. "No one is touching anything. We handle this calmly." But calm was gone. The crowd pressed closer, eyes wide with shock, curiosity, and barely contained excitement. Whispers swelled, a low roar of speculation threading through the air. The room felt like a pressure cooker, each exhale another spark ready to ignite a full explosion. The bride's pulse thundered. She knew she couldn't stop now, not with so many eyes upon her, not with the note exposed, not with the consequences spreading faster than she could control. She raised the bouquet slightly, as if to shield it, as if to declare she would not bend. Her voice trembled but carried, a whisper to no one in particular. They deserve to know. The distant relative froze for a moment, hesitation flickering across his face. Then anger flared again. "No one deserves this shame. It's private, family business." The mother's hands shook, tears forming. "Please, for all our sakes, don't let this ruin everything." The father's chest tightened. Every carefully built expectation of the wedding, the vows, the music, the smiles, now teetered on the edge. He realized fully, this moment wasn't just chaos. This was a rupture. A single wrong action, and everything could collapse. A subtle glance from a guest caught his attention, a knowing smirk, a whispered exchange between two relatives signaling that even more eyes were watching, judging, and ready to act. The chain reaction was no longer contained to the bride and her immediate family. The bride's grip did not waver. Her defiance and fear blended into determination. She understood that whatever happened next could not be undone. One movement, one word, one choice could send the wedding spiraling into disaster or force a truth long hidden into the open. And then, just as the relative's hand brushed the bouquet again, I saw it. A flicker of recognition crossed someone's face, a gasp that hinted at the note's secret being revealed, and I knew the next moment would change everything: vows, family, and the wedding itself, forever. The room held its breath. The relative's hand shot toward the bouquet again. This time, the bride did not flinch. She pulled back sharply, pressing the flowers to her chest like armor. Their eyes locked, the silent tension between defiance and anger stretching taut, almost unbearable. A gasp ran through the crowd. Whispers exploded into murmurs, some guests leaning forward in disbelief, others recoiling, hands covering mouths. The ceremony itself had paused, every gaze fixated on this moment, every heart pounding with anticipation. Her mother stepped closer, voice trembling, hands reaching, trying to mediate, to stop the collision she feared would destroy everything. "Please, think about what you're doing," she pleaded, panic threading through each word. The father stood frozen, chest tight, a storm of conflicting emotions raging within him. Fear, responsibility, helplessness, and hope clashed all at once. He knew he had to intervene, but any movement risked setting off the chain reaction further. The bride took a slow, deliberate breath. Then she did something unexpected. She tilted the bouquet just enough for the top fold of the note to peek out. A few words, partial, fragmented, but unmistakable, were visible. The whispers grew louder as realization struck. Even the distant relative froze, eyes widening. Guests' reactions intensified. Some gasped audibly, others whispered urgently to their neighbors. Shock, curiosity, and fear twisted through the room like wildfire. The tension had reached its peak, and everyone felt the weight of what had been revealed, even if they didn't know the full truth. Her mother's hands fell to her sides. "No, no," she muttered, eyes wide, realizing control had completely slipped. The father's stomach knotted. Every careful plan, every expectation of the day seemed to teeter on the edge of ruin. He realized the note's secret, whatever it contained, was powerful enough to reshape everything in the room: relationships, reputations, even the wedding itself. The relative stepped back, jaw tight, eyes flicking between the bride and the bouquet. His anger had not vanished, but for the first time he seemed uncertain, almost cautious. The room shifted, like everyone collectively waiting for the next domino to fall. The bride's grip did not falter. She met her mother's eyes, her defiance tempered by a quiet, almost sorrowful determination. She knew the consequences would be lasting, but she could not, would not, undo the choice she had made. And then, a sudden movement from the back of the room, a hand raised, a gasp louder than all the others, and I knew the next moment would either finally bring the truth crashing fully into the open, or ignite a conflagration that would shatter everything we had ever known. I stood there, watching her, my daughter, and I realized something that had been true since the first quiet morning of this day. Sometimes love means letting go, even when the cost is more than you can bear. And yet, as every eye remained fixed on the bouquet, I couldn't help but wonder what would be left of us all when the note's full truth finally surfaced.